Hello and welcome to the Utility Week podcast. I'm Rob Horgan, and for the next couple of episodes, we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of poring over the biggest news of the past fortnight, we thought we'd recap some of the key moments from Utility Week Live. In this episode, the focus is very much on the water sector and in particular the upcoming regulatory changes. During the second half of this pod, you'll hear from the current crop of regulators, including Ofwat CEO Chris Walters, WICS Chief Exec David Satti, and the Environment Agency's Director of Water, Helen Wakeham. But before we come to them, we're going to listen back to Anglian Water Chief Executive Mark Thurston's sit-down interview with our very own James Wallin. I hope you enjoy listening.
You entered the sector at a period where it was really in the spotlight, and things, fair to say, been pretty tough in terms of the scrutiny on the water sector over the last few years. I mean, we'll notice that we have security around the stage today, and I know that you have been one of a number of CEOs that have had a citizen's arrest performed on you. People have been talking for years about us getting to the kind of nadir of this and then starting to go up. Do you think that with the Cunliffe review and the reforms coming in, do you think we've reached that point now where we're able to start going up on the curve in terms of public trust in water companies, or do you think sadly there's further to go?
Oh, I think there's more work to go to bridge the gap between where sort of public social discourse is with water companies. I mean, it's clearly been highly politicised in the last few years, and I came into this job with my eyes open. But I do think we're on a bit of a turning point. I mean, I think the opportunity for the sector, the talent it's now attracting, the investment it's now attracting, the opportunities to create careers. I think, frankly, again, as a sort of relatively new person, understanding just how much, not just as I talked earlier about, we're in the public health business, but just how dependent our appetite for growth in this, to grow the economy, how important water is to that on several fronts, whether it's housing, development, so forth. So I think we're definitely at a tipping point, and there's more we need to do. And I think that's the challenge for the industry, is how to ask our partners, our suppliers, the way we engage with the public, where we can start to talk about water in a much more positive way, I think is what hopefully AMP8 will see that turn. So that would be sort of my ambition for AMP8, that we've sort of moved that narrative to something much more balanced. Because water companies are doing great work every day, but that's not necessarily what you'd read in the papers. So it's about sort of demystifying some of that and bringing more balance to the conversation. And we're a big employer as a sector. We're probably at about 11,000 people now, and across the whole of east of England. We include now the supply partners at Anglian, and that'll grow probably to close to 15 in this AMP alone. So we're a big employer, and there's a lot we can do, creating skilled jobs, good jobs for folks in the region. So I think there's a lot to play for. But I think to your question, I think there is still a bit more we need to do. But frankly, we've only just got through year one. I think year one looked a lot like the back end of AMP7. So the sort of curve of investment and the curve of opportunity, to some extent, is in front of us.
And has that impacted your ability to recruit people? I mean, you talked about the people who work for Anglian, really bought into the mission there. But are you struggling to bring new people into the industry? You're not?
No, we're not. I mean, this year alone, we're going to hire something like 130 apprentices, our biggest intake yet. We probably had 1,500 applications. So it's great to see we're attracting mostly young people into the sector. There's inevitably some movement between the sector, but I think you're seeing people come out of other sort of infrastructure arenas, rail, highways, and so forth. We do have a lot of interaction with the energy and power sector, particularly in our patch. So it's pleasing to see that we don't churn a huge amount of staff actually because of this, I think, this sort of geographic pool that we have. But nevertheless, thus far, it's not proving to be a challenge. Inevitably, one of the questions often new joiners ask is around the sort of reputation issues, and that's something we just need to be sensitive to. But I think once you get past that, actually, there's a lot of good that's going on. I think we can create an opportunity to create really great skilled careers for people in the water sector.
Right, let's touch on those reforms that you've already mentioned. So we had the report from the Independent Water Commission last summer, and obviously we got the white paper from government earlier this year. as yet, no transition plan for the reforms. Really looking out for that. What do you want to see from that transition plan in terms of turning those reforms into a reality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've seen the draft, and the appointment of a transition chair is sort of out. We understand there was a mention of the King's speech last week, so we know government are committed to the reform agenda. Our understanding is that we'll probably see the transition plan out, I suspect, in the autumn, including then the sort of early drafts of the legislation that will go through the House. So I think the sector's ask of government would be, you've started something here by looking to reform the sector. There's a huge amount of appetite in the sector to see those reforms through. Sort of hold your nerve, sort of make sure we don't, in amongst a sort of a challenging political environment, do not lose sight of what this reform will deliver, for customers, for the environment, and see the legislation through. And I think to your question around what's our ambition for that is at the end of this AMP, as we sort of go into the planning for PR29, we get a view of a sort of different planning regime for AMP9 and beyond. We move to a more integrated regulator that's got more regional understanding, and I think that relate, a little bit like to some extent the relationship between Scottish Water and its regulator. And I think the prize for the country as consumers is that we put the sector on a sensible footing. It's investable. We've got long-term patient investors around the sector. Keep them, customers, and the environment all in mind as we move the sector forward. So it needs to be investable, but also affordable. And I think the other thing that the reforms need to have one eye on is what, frankly, we can afford as customers. Inevitably a lot of coverage around the increase in bills at the beginning of this AMP. I think, candidly, when I see the health of our assets, I could see investment at that sort of level having to endure for several AMPs to sort of recover that backlog of underinvestment. So we've got to find a balance, frankly, I think, between sort of policymakers, government, water companies, and our investors. How do we get this sort of investable, affordable sort of 10, 15 years, where, to your earlier question, we really start to change the narrative about what water does for the country.
Do you think it's a missed opportunity that we haven't really had that conversation? I mean, in Wales, for example, it was a green paper as opposed to a white paper, so it's getting input from the public. But do you think we've really had that honest conversation with the public about the asks you've got of cleaning up bathing waters across the country, investing in infrastructure, future-proofing the system? That's going to cost a lot of money on bills, and bills are going to keep going up in perpetuity going forward. Do you think that the public are properly aware of that scenario?
I think the public are much more tuned to the issues around the water sector than they probably were a couple of years ago. I think the media, many of the big broadsheets have sort of made particular campaigns around that. And I think a lot of the investors in water companies are sort of shown in a particularly poor light, and whether that's fair or not is a separate debate. But I think the reality is we've had our water incredibly cheap for a long time compared to many other utilities, and at some point that's got to be redressed. Have we missed the opportunity? Frankly, we sort of can't change the past. But I think now, again, to your earlier question, I think we're on a cusp of shifting the conversation between consumers, water companies, policymakers. Because the reality is, if we want a sustainable water system that protects the environment, that is affordable, but also facilitates growth in the economy, that's quite a conundrum to sort of square away. And I think it's only responsible, on the sector and government to sort of find a way of creating a conversation with water companies and customers rather, so that customers understand what they're paying for. And certainly there's a sort of national campaign. We've got our version of it in the East. So customers do understand that this increase in bills is about a much more reliable system. It's much more predictable. We are going to build reservoirs. We do want to protect the beaches and the chalk streams. And all these things have got to be paid for in some fashion. I think it's then about over what duration do we pay for it, frankly. I think and to your point, I think this is, I won't say the bills would go up in perpetuity, but I think we could see bills start, there'd be a sort of steady rise in bills to recover the position for several AMPs.
One of the big recommendations from the Cunliffe review. The sort of headline recommendation there is the abolition of Ofwat and the creation of a single regulator. What's your vision of what that regulator is going to look like, and how do you see it coping with the trade-offs inherent of merging all those regulators together? Because we have those separate regulators for a reason. So how do you see them dealing with those trade-offs?
Well, I think I think you've used the phrase I would have used, which is at the nub of the mindset of the new regulator, is this mindset of trade-off. That at the moment, we have an economic regulator tell us how much money we can have and what bills are going to be. We have an environmental regulator that sets a whole set of requirements, and we have a drinking water inspector that does the same. And actually, the water companies are having to make those trade-offs, and that's a suboptimal solution. I can see that firsthand in England. That's part of why we went to the CMA, to put ourselves on a position where we have a sort of financial footing for AMP8 that means we can serve customers and the environment and meet all those requirements. So I think that mindset of trade-offs is absolutely essential, because and I think one of the things that will be important for us is to probably move away from a desire for greater and greater environmental sort of compliance. That's not about coming away from our environmental aspirations, but I think the bit where we need to be prepared to put more money in the next 10, 15 years is in asset health. The core assets have not been invested in. I see that as an electrical engineer. I can go to sites and see firsthand, even for someone who's not been in the sector for very long, just how much lack of investment there's been. So I think this trade-off point, drinking water quality we would never compromise. Then I think it's about how do we trade off the growth in any particular geography, maintaining asset resilience and asset health, but at the same time making sure we serve the environmental implications. And that's not an easy one. So I think frankly, that's got to be co-created between a water company and a regulator. At the moment, it's sort of done a little bit at arm's length. It's slightly transactional. Obviously, we work with a national economic regulator. We have some regional conversations with the Environment Agency. I think bringing those together and having a sort of and co-creating any particular business plan for any 5-year period, where we look at what can customers afford and what's reasonable to expect customers to bear with all these demands. I think that's got to be the starting position as a sort of frame of mind, and I think that would be my ambition, and that's going to need quite a shift, I think, on both sides of that conversation from where we are today.
So tell me a little bit more about what you mean when you say moving away from environmental compliance. So what would that mean?
Well, it's more environmental enhancement. We've seen more and more requirements for environmental enhancement into the region. So a lower level. I mean, I'm not a chemist, but lower levels of phosphate, nitrate. The tolerances for what we've deemed to be environmentally acceptable has got tighter and tighter. And the ambition of that is sound. I'm not suggesting it's wrong, but we're then designing and installing equipment on top of an asset base that frankly is 20, 25 years old and is desperate in need of renewal. And what I've seen in other sectors, particularly in rail and road, is you sort of have to look after the base assets to start with before you start layering more and more enhancements on top. And I think we've sort of swung towards an environmental enhancement ambition without thinking about the health and resilience of the core assets, whether it's power supplies, sewers, mains pipes, water treatment works, you name it. And fundamentally, they are not going to change in any time soon, but they are, many of them, getting to the end of their expected life. So I think we've got to make sure we look after those assets and then work out what is the appropriate level of environmental enhancement we want to layer on top of that we can afford. That's the challenge, I think.
In terms of creating this new regulator, are you concerned about the amount of influence that the current regulators are having in those conversations? I know Water UK has called for a shadow board to be set up, immediately. Is that something that you would back? I can see the concern. I mean, my personal interaction with Ofwat has been pretty good. I think they recognise that they're going to need to change, and I think they are taking a sort of first among equals approach to bring the bits of the agency and DWI together. I don't think we should be under an illusion about how complicated it's going to be to create a new regulator sort of in the public arena. That's not something that happens very often.
I think the reality is the sort of fundamental sort of economic engine that sits inside Ofwat has got to find its place in the new model, but the economists that sit in Ofwat have got to sit alongside the environmentalists and the drinking water quality folks and come back to this point around there needs to be a sort of new set of rules that make these trade-offs. And as I said, we need to make, as those entities come together, they're going to have to sit across the table from us as water companies and start to discuss what do we need to do in this part of the country, because all parts of the country are different. What do we need to do? What can customers afford? And what's our ambition for the next 5, 10, 15 years? Because I think that's the other thing that we need to think about, James, is we may well create business plans for any 5-year cycle, but the reservoirs in our case are great in point. These are 20-year investments, right? So you've got to sort of put sort of the economic and financial sort of building blocks down that's going to fund a program like that for several AMPs. So again, I'm encouraged by some of the noises. It's early days. I think it would be unhealthy to create something totally new, as in, and go and hire a load of new people. Inevitably, it's going to be a blend where you bring a lot of that corporate knowledge from the existing. But I think the leadership of a transition chair and resetting some of the leadership is going to be important. And I think to the credit of the 3 organisations in question, they understand that.
You talked before about being prepared for PR29. Now I presume you're already into the second year of the current AMP. Presumably, business planning for that next cycle really needs to start pretty soon. What kind of direction, what kind of certainty do you need as a CEO, and when, in order to plan for that next cycle?
Yeah, I think there's 2 or 3 things. I think there's this point around what realistically do we think is an appropriate level of customer bills, recognising they've already gone up. So what sort of socially is acceptable? I think that we need to sort of peg that as one point. We need to understand what's going to be the return for investors, because we're going to have to put a lot of money into the sector. We are in this AMP, we have to in future AMPs. So, again, we've got patient long-term investors that are entitled to a fair return. So we're going to need to understand what's the premise of that. Clearly, I think Ofwat are going to take the lead initially, and my engagement with Ofwat has been to sort of almost go a little bit back to first principles and probably simplify the business planning process. It's a very, very complicated process. It ties up thousands of hours on both sides of a water company and the regulator. And actually, I think we've been doing this many years now. So I think there's a strong, appetite to simplify that process, particularly for AMP9, recognising their regulators going through some level of transition. But equally, what we're starting to think about it in very early days in Anglian around, so what's going to be important to our business? How do we serve the environment, serve customers? On the assumption that we're about 11 billion this AMP, that could grow somewhere between maybe 11 and 15 billion next AMP. There's only so much capital can go into the system. There's a deliverability test. How much can we deliver? Because I think we're at a scale that's unprecedented in the water sector. And then it's come back to my earlier point, where do we put the money? Do we put the money in enhancements? We need to maintain drinking water quality. And how do we sort of maintain resilient assets? And then we've got to facilitate growth. And so I think all these things have got to be in the melting pot as part of that PR29 thinking. And we certainly intend at Anglian to sort of get a little bit out on the front foot and what, in an ideal world, what would we do? Clearly, the regulator's going to come back towards us with their own thinking, but I think it'd be a big test for the industry, and a great opportunity for the industry is, again, to sort of have a slightly more, dare I say, collaborative, collegiate approach to planning for AMP9 than it's hitherto had, which is quite transactional and a little bit sort of behind, and there's reasons for that. I think we need to, at least for AMP9, until the new regulator's established, be a bit more growing up and sort of have a slightly more open, let's say loosely open book approach to business planning.
So in terms of that, getting at least an indication of to what extent bills can go up and what the rates of return to investors are going to be like. Now, in order for you to get that in the short term, presumably that's going to have to come from the existing regulator. It's going to have to come from Ofwat, isn't it? But isn't there a legitimacy issue there with a regulator that has been told that it's being abolished, setting quite fundamental directions for 2030 to 2035?
Yeah, I mean, the legitimacy thing's quite an emotive point, right? So at the end of the day, Ofwat are the statutory regulator until they're not. And they've got a job to do, and they've got to discharge their statutory obligations. And I would expect Chris and Helen to sort of come out on the front foot and say to the industry, this is our early thinking. And I think, to their credit, when I've spoken to them, they're keen to consult. So they've said, we want to come out to the industry and say, this is how we would propose the business plan for AMP9. And I think they'll get a reaction from all the Water UK members on that. And I think that'll go through a couple of iterations. So, I could see others would want to maybe mischief make around the legitimacy point. But I think the big thing from the water sector will be, if Ofwat are going to take the lead on that, to my own point, have a slightly open mind about it, what it looks like, make sure they bring DWI and the Environment Agency into the equation, because those things have been somewhat kept out of it, and at least in the spirit of the reform, start to do it as a much more collective effort, rather than it's a bilateral one, and then we're having to sort of juggle these other demands with no recourse to what it costs. So I think I'm a sort of glass half full person, James. I'd like to think that people will see what's sort of obvious. I think to your point, if it sort of goes the other way and we go down a sort of let's do what we've always done, I think there'll be that then will I think create some inevitable tension in the sector, and would be the wrong thing to do, frankly.
I hope you're not accusing me of mischief making, Mark, because
I never said anything.
That was the last thing I would want to do. Right, I'll go to the audience for questions in just a second, but I just want to touch on the deliverability point which you raised. So, as I say, we're now into the second year of the current AMP. I mean, how is delivery going so far? How confident are you that you're going to be able to deliver what are some really ambitious targets?
Yeah, and for the audience, to put some dimension around that, we did about $1 billion plus last year in CapEx, which is similar to the last year of AMP7. That goes to about 1.6 billion this year. So that's unprecedented in the history of Anglian. And Anglian's always had quite a big capital programme and probably been seen as a bit of a leader in the sector in terms of the way it sets its supply chain up. I mean, the good thing is the @ONE Alliance, which is very intimate to Anglian and knows us very well. We've been working on this for sort of 2 years, both in AMP7 and before. So we've seen the programme coming towards us. I think in the first year we got something like 1,000 schemes away. So, that's the throughput that we've not seen before. The SPA pipeline is in, 86, 87% complete now. So that's been a big test for us, because that got off to frankly, a bit of a rocky start in AMP7. I think the work in AMP8 is going very well. And of course the reservoirs, we're well on our way with the development phase. We've got to start working with Rapid and Ofwat and the agency around when do we take that through into DCO and so forth, but the engagement has been good. So I think, I'm encouraged about what I've seen so far. We've been to market for a new major projects framework, and actually we've been really pleased at the market appetite, and that's to join Anglian as a partner, probably 2 frameworks for major projects in this AMP, but it will endure into AMP9. And then, my colleague Karen is on another panel here today. We're already thinking about AMPs 9, 10, 11, and what are the succession arrangements beyond AMP8. So there's a lot in play, frankly, but we're a results business, and we're pretty diligent. With my background, as you can imagine, we're pretty focused on making sure we're doing the basics well now, getting the designs and the schemes away with our existing supply chain. But we look forward to bringing 2 new partners into the sort of Anglian Water family, probably sometime through over the next year.
Thank you, Mark. Right, let's go to the audience for questions. Okay, we've got a question down here.
Hello, Callum Gibson from BRG. There's a petition on the UK Parliament website to hold a referendum to bring the water industry into public ownership. That was tabled a few weeks ago and has reached, it's 120,000 signatories already, which means it's definitely going to be debated in Parliament. How serious is the threat of nationalisation?
Yeah, I don't have a view, really. I mean, I think so. One of my observations as someone new to the sector is that as a consumer, and I'm a consumer of water both in the region I work and where my home is, which are different places. So I pay a water bill in 2 parts of the country. I think as consumers, I think we should be quite grateful that our water supply and the investment in our water is in the private sector at the moment, because I think in a world where the water sector was competing for public funds in the current environment with the challenges on defence and social and health and welfare, education, national security, I think water would struggle. I think other parts of the public purse have been stretched in infrastructure, and I think if water is in that queue, I think as consumers we should be quite concerned about that, because to my earlier point, huge amount of capital's got to go into the sector in the next 10, 15, 20 years to really provide a resilient water service for the next generation. I mean, the actual politics of it, there's no point in me commenting. It's sort of conjecture, really. I know it's part of the public mood. My focus at the moment is making sure that Anglian does the things that are in front of us in this AMP, and certainly we have patient long-term investors who've been with the company a long time, and they're deeply invested in the sector. So I can only work with what's in front of me, and we'll see where that petition goes, I guess.
Hi, Mark. Melina from Microsoft. Anglian's leading one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the water sector at the moment. What are some of the risks you see to not being able to deliver that successfully, and how does the supply chain need to change to be able to mitigate that?
I guess we've got all the sort of usual risks you'd see in delivery. I mean, there's no doubt that there's been a lot of learning in the company by building the pipeline, because I think up until that point, most of what we did was sort of behind our fence line. No one saw us. We were pretty self-contained. But the pipeline sort of brought our work into the public domain in a way that we probably weren't prepared for. And I think that's giving us a lot of learning, particularly in the context of the reservoirs. The reservoirs, we haven't built a reservoir for 40 years in this country. So I think that's the bit that's really going to test us in terms of understanding the impact of construction, how we get through the planning process. There's lots of technical issues around the reservoir which you'd expect that sort of sit as an integral part of providing a whole new water supply to the region. But I think the supply chain's up for it. I mean, to my earlier point, many of the sort of usual suspects already work for us at Anglian. They're part of our alliancing arrangement. But we've seen through this major projects tender, some other big European contractors want to come and play, which I think is super important, because I don't think the UK supply chain is big enough in its own right to serve the sector for the next 10 years. So, the big French, Spanish, German contractors, candidly, particularly when we get to big civils, is where we're going to have to play. And but my experience tells me that what we're going to have to do is give the supply chain plenty of notice. If we think we can get to year 3 or 4 of the AMP and say we need you to step up in year 5 and year 1, sort of the next 2 years, it won't happen. This is sort of 2 to 3 years in the making. We need to give the supply chain a long run up to the scale of what's coming towards us. Because my experience is they will then mobilise, they'll recruit, they'll come into the region, they'll build up the capability, they'll build up the tier 2s and 3s locally that we'll need. But they won't do that overnight. That is years, not weeks and months of work. So I think that's where we need to be much more sophisticated and more open as a client to make sure that we give the supply chain a fair chance of knowing what the scale of the prize is.
That was James Wallin interviewing Anglian Water CEO Mark Thurston recently at Utility Week Live. Next up, James is back and he's joined by Helen Wakeham of the Environment Agency, Ofwat's Chris Walters and David Satti from WICS to look at the future of water regulation and discuss the outcomes of the Cunliffe review. And
I want to start out by just asking quite a general question about, before we get into the details of the reforms, just what vision are we heading towards for the water sector? What is the destination for these conversations that we're on? And I'll start with you, Helen.
Thanks, James, and good morning, everybody. It's always good to see standing room only. Hello at the back. Oh, look, waves at the back. So I think the starting point is that there's lots of views about what a reformed water system looks like, but absolutely nobody said to Sir John Cunliffe that the system we've got now is the right one. We've had privatisation for 36 years. We've had an Environment Agency for 30 years. It's 30-year anniversary of the Environment Agency. What's happened in that time is that a well-thought-out and integrated system for environmental regulation has accrued layers and it's accrued moss. And I think there's also been very little public discourse about water, hasn't there, until the last 5 years. So it is a system which is ripe for reform. So in terms of vision, what do we need? We need something that takes a systems approach. We're looking enviously at Scotland, where their waterways are at, what did you say, 86% good ecological status in Scotland, 16% in England, in a crowded country where our land and our water are multifunctional. So what we really need, my vision, and I think the vision that John Cunliffe set out, is taking a systems approach, understanding where we're trying to get to in terms of environment, people, public health, and planning for that together. So I think from a vision perspective, there's a really strong direction.
Thank you, Helen. Chris?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I agree with Helen's diagnosis and the importance of the reforms to delivering that. But to address your question a bit more directly, what do I think success looks like? I'd like a water sector that the nation can feel proud of. I'd like us to behave as stewards towards our natural water environment. I'd like a system of oversight and support for that stewardship, but also holds us to account if we fail to live up to it. And on the journey between here and there, I want regulation to be seen as a solution and not a problem.
Thank you, Chris. And David, I'd like to get your view, but perhaps if you could just give a very, very brief kind of summary for anybody who's not familiar in the room with how the situation in Scotland differs from in England and Wales.
Yeah, sure. So, good morning, everyone. Scotland, water is one of the areas in Scotland that's devolved. So there is an economic regulator, WICS. There's a separate environmental regulator, SEPA. And a separate drinking water quality regulator, and it is publicly owned. So it is a very different setup, although a lot of the learnings, a lot of my understanding of economic regulation came from Sir Ian Byatt, who set up Ofwat back in the day. So while it's different, it's still very similar. And we are constantly looking south of the border really to understand how can we get better. And I'm really excited about the reform. Actually, I look at this a bit like the glass half full, in that we're finally talking about the longer term challenges that the sector faces. And we're trying to do that in a way that is in a system rather than a silo. And it's genuinely felt a wee bit more of a lonely voice north of the border. We've tried to look at, the condition of the infrastructure, what we're passing on to future generations. We're finally starting to talk about it. And more importantly, we're starting to think, what are the key things that's going to enable that change? And that's as applicable north of the border as it is in England or Wales.
Brilliant. Thank you all for that. So then I want to delve a little more deeply into this then. So as I said, it's been now almost a year since the review, and while we have had some encouraging signs from government, it's still not entirely clear how much of the recommendations from the Independent Water Commission are going to be taken forward, what a single regulator for the water sector will look like, how it will work on a regional level, how a catchment-based approach is going to work. The devil in the detail still really isn't clear. So I'd just like to ask you what areas of encouragement you see so far and what we've heard, and what are the things we really need to hear from government in the short term. So again, I'll go down the line. Start with Helen.
It's always going to be me first. So there's lots to be cheerful about, is there not? We are just starting the biggest ever investment in our water infrastructure, 104 billion over 5 years. That investment doesn't, the case that's made for that investment doesn't come from nowhere. That's painstaking work from everybody across the sector, the regulators, the public, everybody acknowledging that this work needs to be done. That's a really good, encouraging sign, is it not? I think it's hugely encouraging that politicians across the spectrum are all talking about water and the need to invest in water. So I think the case is made. That's hugely encouraging. I think a continued emphasis on the systems approach is encouraging. When Chris talks about the water sector broadly, he's talking about the water industry. When I talk about the water sector, I'm talking about a multi-sector approach. I'm talking about the water industry, farming, transport, everybody who has an impact on the water environment. And just a couple of weeks ago, the River Mease, the Cabba partnership, was a winner of the UK Rivers Prize. Now, that is not a water industry scheme. That is local authorities, the Environment Agency, Natural England, catchment authorities, farming, working together to improve a river. That systems approach is well embedded in what's expected of the new regulator and the new approach. And I think that's a brilliant sign for the future.
To achieve the vision set out in the white paper and mentioned in the King's speech in the form of the Clean Water Bill, I think there are probably 5 critical success factors. I think the first is a system that removes the gaps and overlaps between the existing regulators. The second is a proper strategic framework for balancing ambition, affordability, investability, and deliverability. I think the third is an integrated catchment-based approach to water and wastewater planning. I think the fourth is embedding all of that in a much longer-term framework than we've had before. And I think the fifth is a change in collaboration and tone amongst the constituent parts. I think there's progress on all 5 of those areas right now, and that's the progress that I expect to see continuing.
So, David, interested in your thoughts of what you're seeing looking on from Scotland.
Well, I was struck. There was a conference a couple of weeks ago in Cunliffe, was presenting at it, and he was highlighting concerns about loss of momentum, and that's always a risk. It's always a risk in a political process. But as Chris is saying, a lot of things are happening under the surface, and we engage a lot with DEFRA, and we're encouraged that actually, back to Chris's last point, a lot of the right people are getting into the rooms and they're having the right conversations, which for me is the first step. We try to do that in Scotland a lot more often. We're a small village, but it completely changes the dynamic when you're sitting and you're understanding, the perspectives of other regulators and the company, when you're trying to really understand the problem you're trying to solve and the success factors. So, I'm encouraged that I'm seeing the right people in the room talking about the right things. And if anything, I guess the challenge for us is how do we keep pace?
So just to come back on all of that with a bit more substance, I'm very surprised that John Cunliffe is talking about a lack of momentum, because actually this is a massive reform. It's a once-in-a-generation reform. It is really important that we get it right. And we are talking about what good looks like, but there's a lot that's going on in the interim. So we're already planning for Price Review 29. There's a much closer working relationship between all of the regulators to do that, working with the water industry, best value approach to the next round of investment. We're talking about how we bring all our data and intelligence together. We're talking about what sanction and enforcement looks like between us. What is our control strategy to make sure that the water industry delivers what it is paid to deliver? So across the board, people aren't just talking in rooms, they're actually getting on with designing a new system that will fit into the new model, whatever it looks like.
So in terms of the right people being in the room, and this is you know what's coming now, don't you? You know what's coming. We're having a discussion yesterday with Mark Thurston at Anglian, because I've had many conversations with people in the water sector about who are the right people to be in the room, and specifically, how involved should Ofwat, Environment Agency, Drinking Water Inspectorate be in building this new regulator and setting up the parameters for the next price control? You can see why people would have some concerns about, on the one hand, saying we want to get rid of the existing system, and then allowing the people at the centre of the existing system to build the next system. So, Chris, I'll let you go first on this one.
Thanks very much, James. When you're building anything, you need an architect and you need a builder. I understand reservations about the architects of the past being the architects of the future, but we're not. The existing regulators are not the architects of the future. That's what's set out in the white paper. That's what will be set out in the transition plan. That's what's mentioned in the King's speech, bringing forth the Clean Water Bill. But you need people to build that vision of the future, and the capabilities and skills for doing that in large part do sit with the people who do regulation at the moment.
Oh, you're so pleased with your question, James, aren't you?
Yes.
You would expect me to agree with Chris, and I do, from an Environment Agency perspective. Regulation is a profession and a discipline. Most of the people involved in regulation of this sector have been involved in regulation or planning for other sectors, including Chris, your experience is broad, is it not, across the public sector? The Environment Agency is the regulator of many sectors. I think we do have the expertise. I'm also, if you haven't read about the new special advisor to water reform, Dame Julia Black, her CV is a very interesting read. So she's very experienced in the design and implementation of risk-based regulation. She understands a lot about supervision. She's worked at the Bank of England. So I think we're getting some really good architecture advice, and we're doing some really good thinking and thinking very broadly about what regulation looks like. And really, the risk is in the conversation that we have a conversation about the structural design of a new regulator. What really matters is that we have a planning and regulatory system that delivers, and we're really focused on that.
And just touching on the transition plan, it's something we're all waiting for. I asked Mark about this yesterday. His view was that we're going to get a transition plan probably in the autumn. What are your expectations, either of you, for that going?
Well, like a true civil servant, I'm going to say we'll expect it in due course.
In June, of course. Helen, you were going to say the same thing, got it?
I can't improve on that. I was hoping for rather earlier than the autumn, but like Chris, it would be unwise to speculate.
Right. I just wanted to go into that. I know you're saying this isn't the most important thing, but I think to look at the what that new regulator is going to look like. I think there's some important theoretical questions to go into there, and I'm interested in all your views on this. That there are each of the regulators in England, Wales, and in Scotland has their own remit and are kind of laser focused on their own remit. Over the years, that there has been kind of regulation scope creep, and there's been more that's been taken on, but there are still clear parameters between the different regulators. How do you see those trade-offs being handled within a single regulator, and how do we avoid the risk that, let's say, drinking water quality, which is something that the UK can be really proud of, doesn't get undermined by a focus on other areas? And perhaps I'll come to David first, because this is something, obviously you have a similar system in Scotland.
Yeah, so where would I start with that, God? Well, the first thing I'd say is that there's precedents for that. If you look at safety regulation and economic regulation in, say, the CAA, or the ORR, these are not novel solutions that Cunliffe is putting forward. What my starting point would be that trade-offs always happen, or at worst, they're pretended that there's not a trade-off. And if it's two different bodies, then it needs a higher power to make that trade-off, which places a lot of reliance on government. So for me, I see the merit in having, those trade-offs happening within an organisation that has a mandate from government to do so, provided it's done in a way that, one, it requires judgment. There's no right or wrong answer, and there's no binary one or the other. You just need to apply that judgment on a case-by-case basis. And then as public servants or regulators, you need to be held accountable for those judgments. And be transparent in that. So, for me, the worst is just accepting or pretending that there's not trade-offs, and they just don't then happen. And at least for me, we're starting to lean into that. We're really looking at, well, what are the trade-offs between water and the environment versus price, versus affordability, versus long-term sustainability. We're really leaning into it at this point. So, I'm encouraged with the direction of travel.
Yeah, I agree with that. In my first answer, I talked about 5 critical success factors, and the second was a proper strategic framework for balancing ambition, affordability, investability and deliverability, and that is about the kind of high-level strategic steer that at the moment the system doesn't have. There has to be a legitimate route for democratic and political insight into policy-level trade-offs, not regulatory decisions, far from it, but policy-level trade-offs.
I agree with all of that. I think the one thing that I would add to that is that one strategic steer for all of us creates the right environment to have a conversation about trade-offs, because we all know what we're collectively trying to achieve. We don't have separate objectives. We won't be in competition. We'll be trying to deliver the same thing. And I think the plan for that longer-term planning horizon, we all know the pros and cons of a 5-year planning horizon. The expectation that we do that within an understanding of what we're trying to achieve in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years will also help us with trade-off decisions, because we will not always be looking at the best trade-off today. We'll be looking at the best trade-off over 20 years, and I think that will be really powerful.
And let me bring this to slightly more to the short term. So there are lots of changes coming in the way that the water sector is going to be regulated, but pretty soon water companies in England and Wales are going to have to start building their business plans for the next price control, and we'll come on to the situation in Scotland as well. I mean, what kind of reassurance do you think, what kind of information do those companies need, do you think, and what do you see that first period of sort of 2030 to 2035 looking like in terms of a stepping stone to further reform? So Chris, I'll start with you.
So first, on the process side of things, Helen mentioned the Water Regulators Joint Working Programme that we have. One limb of that, one work stream of that is PR29 planning. So we're not waiting for reform to get on with collaborating on what PR29 should look like. Working back from PR29, we will need to have a firm idea of what the next price review is going to look like sometime next year. So we are doing work well in advance of that. For that reason, it's just too early to say what future investment might look like. That was going to depend on that balance between ambition, affordability, investability, and deliverability. But we're having the conversations around that now. It's just too early to say what the total bill, as it were, in inverted commas, looks like for that next period.
Helen, what are your thoughts about the kind of priorities for?
Well, same as Chris's, because we're working exceptionally closely together. I think I mentioned it earlier, I think there's something around the work that we're doing between us and with the water industry and others about best value, which is developing really quickly, which will help everybody to understand what we need to achieve in the next 5-year period. I'm really encouraged by the work we're doing on the next price review. We're doing a lot of great work together, but I think that's going to be the best thing that we do together in the next couple of years.
Yeah, just to add to that, actually, there's been a lot of focus, understandably, in this session on reform, but we're also getting on with a day job in a much more collaborative way. So as well as the Joint Regulators Programme that Helen set out, there is a water delivery task force convened by the department and chaired by the Minister about overseeing and supporting that £50 billion pipeline of 30 major projects that we have right now that is working in a much more collaborative way. There is also that we know that the nation potentially faces a shortfall of water of 5 billion litres a day by 2025. That pipeline of major projects is needed to improve the resilience of our water supplies, but more is needed as well. We need to change our relationship with water to become stewards, as I described earlier. And again, with the EA, with other regulators, with the sector, and with other stakeholders, we have a water efficiency campaign to nudge the nation into having a different relationship with the water environment. That's another example of joint working in advance of reform.
And David, the timeline in Scotland is a little bit different. So you're about to come to the end of the current price control, and you're currently, I think, looking at the business plans for Scottish Water, aren't you? So.
Yeah. So the first thing to say there is we operate a 6-yearly price review. But in the last price review, we engaged with the government back to what's a democratic decision versus a technocratic. We really pushed the industry to look at a long-term vision for the industry, and that being something that is endorsed by government as part of its policy. So this price review that we're currently conducting is almost the second phase, if you like, of that longer-term vision. So in the last price review, we set a charge path of CPI +2 every year, recognising the longer-term challenges of the industry, the asset replacement issues, the infrastructure is getting older, and we want to maintain services. Plus, the ongoing growth requirements, the resilience requirements are equally as applicable as in Scotland. So, the price review that we're just about to finalise has that within its context. And we'll be publishing a draft determination in June this year. But the key thing for us is there should not be a surprise in that we've already got the longer term path charted. We gave indicative prices in the last price review for what prices might look like in this price review. So we're just testing those assumptions and seeing what's changed since the position a couple of years ago. So hopefully, there is that stability, there's a visibility with the supply chain, and there shouldn't be any surprises for Scottish Water.
What sort of uplift are you looking at in water bills, and how is that going down with the Scottish public?
Well, the first thing to say there is, in the last price review, it was a continued CPI +2 every year. We were looking out 25 years. When you look at the long-term infrastructure replacement needs, when you look at the challenges we face, we recognise for long-term investment. And we recognise that we need to slowly build the supply chain in order to deliver that investment efficiently. So it's not going to depart far too much from that. To answer your second point, and this is the difference between I'll come back to what is government policy versus what is the role of a regulator. So government in Scotland sets its principles for charging. We decide how much revenue Scottish Water can generate. Government, as part of its policy, then determines how that's distributed within different segments of society. So we are tied to council tax bands, which means that the highest paid bill is 3 times that of the lowest paid bill, and more than half of Scottish customers get a discount of sorts. So there is a lot of progressive policy in our charging structure. So how is it going down? I think people accept the long-term challenges of the industry, and it's an industry that that people are proud of and they want to see continued investment in. So no one likes to see price increases, but there's a degree of acceptance of it.
It sounds like there's a lot that we could learn south of the border from that. Do you think there's been enough conversation with the public about the trajectory for water bills and why they need to go up after years of them being flat or even reduced?
I think that's a question I get asked quite a lot, and I think water has gone up the public agenda, certainly in the 3 years I've been working at Ofwat, and probably a few years before that, in a way that was really dramatic. There are 4 components to water bills in England and Wales. There is how much water companies spend running themselves and maintaining their water and wastewater networks. There is how much they invest to improve those networks. There is an amount of the bill that is linked to the performance of those water companies for customers and the environment. If they do better than expected and customers benefit, they get charged more. Conversely, if they do worse than expected, money is returned to customers in the form of lower bills. And then there are financing costs. And I think just breaking down that for the public and having a conversation about what the drivers of each of those 4 things is something that we should probably be doing more of, yes.
I think your question was, have we been having enough public discourse about water bills? I think the answer is no. I think we've been having a very big public discourse about water and sewerage, but we haven't been talking about the whole system. And I think the one thing that we are thinking about, and we haven't really talked about yet, is transparency. So if at the moment the narrative runs is, I don't want to pay my water bill and I don't want to pay more for my water because the water industry is trousering the money and not spending it on investment. I think that the level of investment in our water and what it buys us has been really invisible. So we're working really hard now with Ofwat and others. There's a banner called Clear Waters, which is looking at publicising the work that's going on water. The Environment Agency already has its Water Industry Environment Programme map, which shows live where investment is going into local communities. And I think that one of the best things we can do together is be much more transparent, not just about our regulatory work, where you'll see this sort of drumbeat of me in the media talking about 10,000 inspections here and enforcement undertakings. It really needs to be about the great things that are going on in terms of water investment. So telling that story is what we need to get on to next.
I want to come to the audience for questions in just a moment, but I want to pick up on David's point about this need to invest in asset health, and that again comes back to a conversation that I had with Mark Thurston yesterday. He was really stressing that point that we need to take almost an asset first approach. Make sure that these, in some cases, very, very old pieces of infrastructure have the investment they needed. He was kind of indicating that the pendulum has swung a bit too far in terms of environmental compliance over investment in assets. Helen, I take it you disagree with that point of view.
Well, I find it incomprehensible that anybody would argue that those two things are opposite. Because actually one of the principal impacts that the water industry has on the environment is related to poor asset health and poor asset maintenance. So what we find in having greatly increased the number of inspections of water industry facilities, something like 24% of them have got something wrong with them. That's a mixture of poor maintenance and asset health. Asset health and asset maintenance has always been the water industry's job. I think there's something about the water industry specifically which is different in that most of the industries we regulate have discharge permits and abstraction licenses and emission permits for emissions to air as a side product of the business that they're doing. Asset health, water quality, water resources is the Environment Agency's job for sure, but it is the water industry's job. So we ought to expect that focus on asset health, which drives a better environment. I certainly think there's a case for greater investment, but I think there's also a greater case for more maintenance out the base, and we should be seeing that. That should not be a surprise. I guess the final thing to say on assets is one of the things that the Cunliffe Review said is that there's a plethora of plans, and that's a problem. And the plan for so more water supply and water environment plans are a really good idea, but they are building on the planning that we're doing. And I think in particular I draw attention to drainage and wastewater management plans, which outside a conference like this sound exceptionally dull, but are brilliant. They're the last piece of the water environment planning jigsaw, and I think that emphasis on future asset health, future asset need is absolutely key to the success of the new system.
I think continuing to emphasise the message that there is a relationship between the water that comes out of our taps and the water that's in our natural environment is a really important thing to do, and that proper asset health, understanding and emphasis on asset health is crucial to both, is something that we need to keep doing. We are consulting, I think, today, and I'm looking at my colleague in the audience who's nodding at me, on a revised approach to further incentivise companies to manage asset health in a different and better way. Well,
for me, so I mentioned Serene Bayat earlier. When he first set up Ofwat, there's a letter, I think it's on Ofwat's old website, MD 161, which was written to company executives, which is, if you can evidence the need for greater investment, I'll give you it. And, well, in some respects, we're still waiting. And that was in 1995. So, the penny dropped in Scotland a little bit when actually we started working together on this, because what Scottish Water knew and what it didn't know, and what we wanted and what we didn't want, were just so far apart. So we collectively recognise that unless we start to solve this and we start to communicate to customers the true underlying risks that we're collectively managing, and ultimately a crumbled asset base that we're at risk of passing on to my daughter or her kids when she has them, if we don't actually start to solve it, that is the reality. And for me, it just needs further working collaboratively, companies and regulator, because we've been trying for 20 years to solve it, in our silos, and it's just not worked.
Thank you for listening to the Utility Week podcast. We'll be back in a week or so with more content from Utility Week Live. Goodbye for now.